Overdotya. Overdotya. It is tower.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to you wherever you are and wherever you're watching the show from. I want to welcome everyone to the Tower UNN today or yesterday because of the wonders of how time flows. It fell to our ears nationally, and I must say internationally, that the current, who was, must use past tense, who was the Speaker of Parliament, Jacob Olanya, passed away in Seattle, and the nation is still awaiting to hear a full report on what could have led to his death. Condolences to all family members and people affected by this death, and also condolences to the reality of the health system, which is Uganda, whereby, of course, only a gazetted few can afford such a luxury as attaining healthcare services from the United States, a country whereby even the locals or the people staying in within that, I call it the belly of the beast, cannot afford healthcare, but a Speaker of Parliament in a very impoverished, in quotations, nation did get to go and have access to this service. So condolences to the family and friends affected by this, and we continue to mourn the status of healthcare in the nation, and we continue to mourn these conditions that provide for healthcare to be like this, because it's not out of the blue that our healthcare system is damaged, drained. It is not out of the blue. It is planned. It is executed for the benefit of just a few. So in light of that, I would like to, of course, within tradition, start with the national anthem. And then from the national anthem, we will get to hear, of course, the state anthem of Rwanda. And then from there, we will get to give our condolences to the former Speaker of Parliament. And then we will head into today's program, which is going to be, today we're going to be discussing war on terror in Africa. But microscopically, we're going to be looking at what is the Rwandese battalion doing in Mozambique, and why are they in Mozambique to fight terror in Mozambique, and what does this mean for Africa? So if my producer could bring on the national anthem, and then in that order, we will pick up greetings to all, and of course, thanks to the powers that be that have provided that we're still alive, or I'm still alive, to be able to come here today and do this. Thanks to my spiritual guides, to God ensuring that I still have breath within my breath to say the words that I do say. So we will actually first go, as I said, to the national anthem, and then continue with the program from there.
Uganda, may God uphold thee. We lay our future in thy hand. United, free, for liberty, together we'll always stand. Oh, Uganda, the land of freedom, our love and labor we give, and with neighbors all at our country's calling, peace and friendship.
wetu munirwa tukanya kama kusamarira ngokuri ebitambe ibyatuguhana benzuru wetu muwitamanambo nelibandari teliwerere isitu ya wikatu hembula yitorere nomokele inyatuzoera benzuru wetu muwitesongete yesu nyamase tusomwibanda tukabya twamanya okomunyu namayere tukagana engebe nyibuya nyamwamba wetu sindiko businga nomusinga owabenzururu twamayiriro mugaragawe iwowene mubyenetu emibulu yosi yosi.
It's always such a blessing where we stand to see all, because previously, I think this we do, it's in all levels. You do a trip with your class, and I think I was in secondary 3, secondary 4, and then you get to visit very many different parts of Uganda. I remember we went all the way up to Lake Albert to see the salt mining, and went and saw all the different parks. And it's for some, I don't know if they still do this, but now looking back and visiting all those places, and you visit the equator, or if you're into, just going and seeing different parts of Uganda, and right now thinking about it to its roots, or to its foundings, like the people in that region have names, have stories to tell about those places, and what we live in today strips away that history, strips away that relationship between the people and their surroundings. And it's always good to see a state anthem, and to see the appreciation that is expressed in that state anthem, not only to the people, but to the people and how they are relating to their surroundings. So we must remember that Rwenzururu, in Kasese, it was Mohozi who went and opened up a war on the people of Rwanda. We must remember those things, and we must remember that this government, this parliament, stands to only achieve the total disorientation of our people away from their roots, away from their existence. But people are heavily rooted in the earth, in the ground that they stand on, and the right to the land that is rightfully theirs, or that they are indigenous to. And it's been this government, this parliament's job to make sure that that becomes something that they can achieve. The total, what is it called? The total disruption and dislocation of people. So in light of that, of course, we want to talk about, as I said at the start of the show, the passing of the former speaker of Uganda's parliament, Jacob Olanya. And as we all know, in most cases, entering Museveni's parliament is a risk. It's up to you to make sure that you can secure you coming out alive. But it is always a risk, and you're always playing with your life. And this doesn't only apply when you enter his parliament, even bystanders. So we're going to watch a video commemorating, because the death of the speaker himself, and as I said, condolences to his family, but it's the event of his death that has opened up a discussion that should have been had a long time ago. So if the producer could please play the video, and then we will continue with today's program.
Good morning, Ugandans. I'll say good morning, Owinyi Dolo, Chief Justice, whom younger people are referring to as Chief Injustice. Good morning, Honorable Ruth Acheng. Good morning, President General DP Norbert Mao. Good morning, Honorable Deputy Speaker of Parliament. And good health to you, Speaker, Honorable Speaker, Mr. Olanya. Hope you're able to listen and hear me. James William Mugeni is my name. I'm a medical clinic officer who has seen it all, who has walked the life of health in Uganda. And right now I'm in the United States. Honorable Ruth Acheng, I just pray you have carried a good brain to USA. You are now treating your own, or you are seeing your own being treated in a hospital in the USA. Honorable Ruth Acheng, you have left Mulago Hospital in the hands of crooks. Mulago Hospital is in the hands of crooks, according to media postings. Yes, Tamale Mirundi, once part of you, or who is still part of you, is saying there are crooks fighting over a morgue, over the mortuary in Mulago Hospital, basically for organ trade. Honorable Anita, among the two speakers of Parliament of Uganda, you are here. Justice, Owinyi Dolo, people are referring to you as injustice. Owinyi Dolo, hospitals are justice. If you are just, we are going to get hospital in Uganda. Norbert Mao, you had assigned yourself a role of a one-man army going to fight young people in Uganda, basically activists who are fighting and asking for accountability. They are not politicians, these are just activists. Young people who have dominated the media, who have nobody to look at. Now you have turned it into prayers for Lanya. We don't need prayers, we need hospitals. We need hospitals. We need hospitals. And I'll thank Honorable Jacob Olanya for exonerating me when he says, bring my family here or take me back home. I remember when he came here, when there were protests, I said I wouldn't protest because I am supposed to save his life if I can. And my prayer was, Olanya, walk out of USA hospital and go back, and I want to hear you speaking. All of you, when you have an opportunity to speak, when you have an opportunity for a microphone, you have turned Museveni into God. All of you who have a chance to speak, you have turned Museveni into God. And yet Museveni is moving all of us. He's moving with all of us. It's like we're ending Uganda with Museveni, and all of us are going to the grave with him. The Ndiwulira story. Justice or Winyidolo. Justice is hospitals. If you are just, we shall have hospitals. Olanya has asked us, has asked the country, bring my family here. Olanya presides over 600 members of parliament. Or whatever, that house. If Olanya was in Mulago, all of us, all of them would have already signed maybe a visitor's book, wishing him well. Yes, the diaspora bites. It bites some of us who are here. We think about our families at home, but what about a sick man in an isolated place? Guys, let's fix our hospital at home. Let's fix Mulago. Let's fix Mbale Regional Referral Hospital. Let's fix Mbarara. We are yet too few. Too few. We are not yet that level where everyone will be sick. But we are in the queue. Yes, I told you dignity in dying is not flying away from home. Dignity in dying is dying in the hands of your family. I'm sure Lanya has young children. The children require explanation. The children need nurses, need someone to explain to them what the father is suffering from. They must be at the bedside to see their father. The children need to be helped to go through those emotional scars that you people are not seeing because you have the comfort of flying away from them. We are creating a society of traumatized people. Ruth Acheng, I am so happy that you have flown out finally as a minister here. And my prayer is that I hope you have come with a brain. Walk through the hospital where Olanya is and go back and implement. And fix Mulago Hospital. And fix Mbara University Hospital. And fix Mbara Regional Hospital. And fix Jinja Hospital. Yes. No, but now it's not about prayers. Much as you're asking, we should all pray for Jacob Olanya. No, it's not prayers. God is not Ugandan. It's fixing hospitals. If it was prayers, you would have taken Olanya to God. But you brought him to the American hospital. So let's fix our hospitals. Anita, I'm happy you're here as a speaker. I'm waiting to hear what you'll speak when you go back home. Good morning and good evening and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you.
The gentleman said almost everything that I would have said. And if I could add to that, it would be hospitals are just the physical manifestation of a healthy population. We need to live in a society whereby you're not expected to work and be exploited, and you don't even have access to check if your body is doing okay, to check if your body can continue to function in that society. Health is a basic necessity, and the access to healthcare is a basic necessity for all people living within the society. So if any parliamentarians or any aspiring political leaders or people politically affiliated, it should be at the front of, and meaningfully, because Museveni actually promised healthcare to all Ugandans, but we're here now. Meaningfully, and when we say meaningfully, is come up with a strategy for healthcare that's actually going to be free and accessible to all. And as always, the creator that it is, it's the hand that gives, again, is the hand that takes away. So be careful how you deal with what has been given to you, because the same hand can take it away. So as we enter into today's program, we're going to be talking about the war on terror in Africa, and we're going to be looking precisely at Rwanda in Mozambique. So this is I know our caption said there is an offshore natural gas project that is projected to produce billions of dollars. And Rwanda has been dispatched by France, and when we further look into the program, we'll see why, of course, in company of the US and the UK, to go and fight an affiliated militant group to Al-Shabaab. So if the producer could please go to the next slide, and I'll talk about a little bit about today's sources and why they were picked to talk about this topic. So before we actually get there, we're first going to look at a video. I want to first give out a trigger warning. Today, we're going to be looking at a lot of sensitive images on the screen. We're going to be talking about matters of violence and war on African peoples. So whenever you feel overwhelmed, do take time off for yourself. But yeah, just wanted to give a trigger warning that that's what we're going to be looking at. But this is also the reality for our people. And this is something that has been happening for the past previous months. This is not something that happened 20 years ago, 10 years ago. This is something that has happened within 2021, 2020 up to this date. So do sit tight. We'll start with our first introductory video of how the state of Mozambique itself failed the people of Mozambique in that region and only cared about securing the security of where these natural resources would be taken. So if the producer can play that first video, and then we'll pick up from there.
It's late March in a coastal town in Mozambique, and a group of militants is on the attack.
A vida dos moçambicanos em Palma já era. Só chama, só em Palma.
Thousands of civilians flee as their town is left burning behind them. This isn't the first time scenes like this have played out here, but it's the first time we've seen them captured in such detail. A crisis has been unfolding as local insurgents who've pledged allegiance to the Islamic State execute the largest land grab by an ISIS-linked group in years. And this has created one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. Hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced. And now, over the course of about a week, the insurgents are attacking Palma, a strategic port town with massive global investment. In one scene, hundreds shelter in a hotel while a battle rages outside.
A situação neste momento é crítica em Palma.
The question they're asking,
Are those big choppers coming?
is the Mozambique government going to save them? It isn't. The government exaggerated its response in the days after the attack.
As ações das FDS resultaram na evacuação de outras centenas de cidadãos nacionais e estrangeiros, tendo sido evitado também que infraestruturas.
But we found that government forces weren't able to defend Palma, leaving its citizens to mostly fend for themselves against the insurgents. Evacuations that did happen had to be hastily organized by private companies. For years, the government has heavily censored media coverage of the conflict, obscuring much of what's happening. But we can still discover clues about the situation by examining what is aired by local media, like state-run broadcaster TVM, and by Sky News, which went to Palma after the attack. Combining this footage with visual evidence from survivors, satellite analysis, and ship tracking data allows us to build a fuller picture of an attack which many felt was not a question of if it would happen, but when. The insurgency is known locally as Al-Shabaab, and it first emerged in the province of Cabo Delgado in 2017. Al-Shabaab's recruitment is mostly local and draws on grievances over extreme poverty and corruption. The group has pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. But how close these ties really are is hotly debated. The government, however, tries to maintain the illusion of safety and calm for international investors. But insurgent activity and control have escalated over time, overwhelming Mozambique's severely under-resourced government forces. Now, in March 2021, those forces are tested again. The insurgents' target, the town of Palma, lies here. Just south of Palma is the site of Africa's largest foreign direct investment, a liquefied natural gas project where the primary investor is French oil and gas company Total. The project is hailed as a massive new revenue source that could transform the country. But it's also controversial, in part because its construction displaced many local villages. In the months before the attack, insurgents were getting closer to Palma, prompting Total to strike a deal with the Mozambican government for better security at the multi-billion-dollar gas site. We analyzed satellite imagery which shows at least 9 recently constructed military outposts at key positions around the site. It's clear that the natural gas project, and not the town, is the most secure place when insurgents move in. Now we come to March 24th, the day Al-Shabaab advances on Palma. They quickly take control of parts of the coast and all key roads leading into the town. To the southwest, cutting off a key crossroads for military reinforcements. West on this road, and to the north on this road alongside the town's airstrip. Video obtained and verified by the Times shows a plane trying to land there, coming under fire. In it, we get a rare glimpse of the insurgents. Multiple eyewitnesses told us that the government forces inside Palma retreated quickly after some pockets tried and failed to fight off the insurgents.
There were a few military personnel in Palma, and a few of them had the courage to fight those guys, but some of them were even running away even before they even fight.
We were also told that around 750 soldiers stationed at the gas site stay inside the facility instead of rushing to the city as backup. There's little footage of the insurgents from during the attack, but Islamic State media did release this footage, claiming to show the fighters preparing, along with claims that they targeted a good deal of the town's infrastructure. The Times confirmed damage to 2 banks, government offices, the town's business park, and military and police buildings. The roads are cut off, and the only ways help can now arrive are by sea and air. 3 government helicopters are moved from at least 85 miles away to the airstrip of the natural gas site. But multiple eyewitnesses told us that the helicopters only attempt to fly into Palma once and quickly retreat under fire. Other helicopters do come to the rescue, but they're not government helicopters. They belong to the Dike Advisory Group, or DAG, a South African military contractor hired by Mozambique to help fight the insurgency. Their presence is controversial. Recently, Amnesty International accused them of war crimes, claims which they deny. DAG is one of the only actors capable of conducting rescues. Its executives told the Times that they intervened on their own, without any clear instruction from the government. DAG heads here, to the Amarula Hotel. Its guests are mostly foreign. Now they're joined by over 100 others from around Palma, trying to flee.
Going to Amarula, bro.
But who should be rescued first, and why? With no government oversight, there's no plan. It falls to people like the hotel's manager to come up with one. He's speaking publicly here for the first time.
I'm looking at 220 people in the eyes, and I don't know what to do. We tried our best to make sure everybody's safe, but we couldn't. I wish I could, but I had no means. I had to make decisions. I had to make decisions on people's lives, on people's family.
DAG ultimately makes 4 rescue flights, but their helicopters can't hold much, and just a little over 20 people make it out. Those left wonder if the military will send in the larger helicopters we showed you before, one of which can carry upwards of 30 people.
And the big ones, not in the small ones. I thought I heard 36. If it's the big ones, we don't know if they managed to get there.
With no help coming, they developed their own evacuation plan. using vehicles from the hotel's parking lot to drive outside the town. Some take this route to a quarry where they believe they'll be rescued. As people are loading into the cars, the hotel's owner arranges a last-ditch helicopter rescue. It carries members of her staff and her 2 dogs. She denies the dogs took up space that could have been used by people. The flight is made by a private company that the hotel often chartered for tourist excursions. As for the DAG helicopters, because they have weapons, they provide air cover for this final helicopter rescue. As the ground convoy prepares to make the risky escape over land, there's still confusion over whether they will receive air support too.
They're just there to fetch him. None of us.
He's going to go and talk to them about using the Everett chopper.
But these guys aren't going to give us cover.
That's what they said.
But the aerial resources are stretched too thin, and the cars won't all make it. Photographs showed that several of the vehicles were ambushed and forced off the road. Only a few safely reach this quarry and spend the night hiding. DAG rescues them the next day, and dozens more civilians from elsewhere. The government help never comes. With limited air evacuations, thousands of people throughout the area are forced to flee on their own. The man who shot this video told us what happened.
When we were running, gunshots were everywhere. We were running with our heads down, and a lot of people were falling down because these guys were just opening fire. They didn't care. They didn't care who is whose.
There were a lot of people trying to cross that river, going to the other side. Within a short period of time, the water was red. The water was red with blood.
Tens of thousands go on foot or by bus across the province toward other cities and towns.
Era perto, a maneira que estava a disparar, pessoa a fugir, a vir lá na minha machamba. Saímos junto lá, fugimos até distante não sei, 100 quilômetros a fugirmos para lá no mar.
Many more people line up at the natural gas site run by Total, where at least some government security is present. Sources tell us that civilians were often denied entrance. As the crowd at the site grows, Total decides to organize a rescue, mostly for its own staff. It charters this ferry, seen here docked at the natural gas site. The Total employees appear to be protected by this ship, known as an Ocean Eagle 43, a patrol and surveillance vessel run by the Mozambican government. It's one of the few signs of government intervention during the attack on Palma. Ship tracking data shows they flee south alongside this convoy of mostly private boats. The ferry arrives in the provincial capital of Pemba with over 1,300 passengers, most of them employees. And it makes a second rescue out of Palma a few days later, this time with more locals on board. After the week-long attack, repercussions were immediately felt. Because of the violence, Total has suspended its natural gas operations indefinitely, raising serious concerns about Mozambique's economic future and the people it left behind. Dozens of Total's contractors and subcontractors still remain in Palma. Some told The Times that the company hasn't checked on their safety. Total didn't respond to our request for comment. Based on our tally of evacuations, only a small number of Palma's population were rescued during the attack. Roughly 95% of the population was left behind. Mozambique's defense ministry didn't respond to our questions about their operations in Palma, but after the attack, the country's president downplayed the severity of violence in the city. His forces have since re-entered the town, assuring people that it's safe to return. It's not. A month after the attack, this thermal image reveals large fires burning in Palma, and satellite imagery confirms at least 50 buildings, some of which are seen here, have burn damage. There are near daily reports of gunfire here. Civilians hoping to escape this threat are forced to rely on a volunteer group working with private companies to organize flights and barges. The cycle of violence plaguing Mozambique for 3 years continues. Even now, residents must flee on their own, unable to trust in their government to save them.
Before I give any commentary on that video, I want to refer to one of my, one of my favorite contributors to, of course, just African. One of my favorite contributors to African people, and Frantz Fanon, and he once said he was writing during the war when Algeria was struggling, of course, for its independence. Went there he was a trained psychologist, and he went there, as a psychologist, as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, to help with what was happening in Algeria at the time. He was from Martinique, and if you know your history, Martinique has a lot of African people that were put there after the enslavement of Africans, and he studied in France. And then if we could please go back to that slide with the quote. I think the producer. So I just want to read off that quote that he once said. He said, in the war in Algeria, for example, and I want us to keep this in mind when we look at all the videos we're going to see today. In the war in Algeria, for example, the most liberal-minded French reporters, because I want to take note of this because that report was from the New York Times. It says, in the war in Algeria, for example, the most liberal-minded French reporters make use of constant, ambiguous epithets to portray our struggle. When we approach them for it, they reply in all sincerity they are being objective. For the colonial subject, objectivity is always directed against them. And I want to talk briefly about that video that we just watched. We're seeing a video whereby in that whole video, we saw everyone being rescued or being evacuated from the violence that has been created by, of course, the external pressures. We cannot ignore the big project that's going on offshore. And when you think about that big project going on offshore, the video starts and it says that that project is there to benefit the people of Mozambique. But look around the buildings and what we saw and how the locals were living in that place versus the multi-billion-dollar project that is happening offshore, and how this story is being given back to us. Only less than about 5% of the locals end up getting evacuated, but they are an afterthought. And take a look at who gets evacuated first and given priorities. It's employees of Total. This is in the midst of a human crisis that we didn't even hear at the same beat that we're hearing this human crisis, and how refugees from Ukraine are being resettled and helped. And it's a continuous one. And these people are stuck in between. The first problem is, of course, they're stuck in between the violence there that is produced. I will not only blame the extremist group, but they're created out of the government, and it's an incapability to help the people in that region. And then you have also the foreign investments and the foreign investors who come to exploit that region. So they're already in a pressure cooker of violence, and no one sees this as a what do they call a human crisis. That's what we're calling it. It's not a human crisis. Even the president of Mozambique came and downplayed it and said, we've had bigger attacks. That's nothing to be proud of when this is happening to your people. So if the producer can go on to the next one, we're going to be we're going to enter the program and what we're going to be covering today, because we're going to be looking at why has Rwanda been deployed in Mozambique. If the producer could please play then a video about Rwandan deployment in Mozambique.
Mozambique is now a ghost town, left in ruins, emptied of inhabitants. For a year, this port was a base for Ansar al-Sunna, known locally as Al-Shabaab. But on August the 8th, troops from Rwanda and the army of Mozambique deploying in the north of the Cabo Delgado region took it back.
So they held this town as a strategic town for their sea routes of communication. They also used it to plan further operations inland So capturing it was very important for us.
The security situation is fragile. Residents are afraid and still haven't come home.
There are refugees located in different camps who will need to come back. We are planning for them to be able to come back. There might still be some insurgents in the population. Our job is to ensure that we create the conditions that would ensure that the public is ready to provide information when and if the insurgents appear.
The Rwandan army says most of the jihadi fighters have been pushed down south, where forces of the South African Development Community are deployed. It's a separate but partner force of the Rwandan military. The Rwandans say they've lost 4 men, but that they've killed hundreds of enemy fighters.
These are enemy equipment that was captured in the northern axis, where we came from, all the way from Palma to Mozambique Prime. So you can see the weapons that were captured. These are SMGs, these are magazines. We have machine guns there, RPGs.
A prisoner is brought before journalists. He says he was forced to fight by Al-Shabaab.
We were brought into the forest, and that's where they trained us. They taught us how to dismantle a weapon, how to use machine guns and smaller arms. We then went to the city of Palma to set up ambushes. We waited for Rwandan soldiers to arrive, and we fought them.
The soldiers bring us to Mbao, another jihadi base once used for training, taken back in August. It takes hours to drive there, across terrain where there's a high risk of getting attacked.
This was the tactical headquarters of the enemy, the insurgents, who were in different locations. We also dislodged him from there, and he moved further south to Mesaro River, where our forces are still, trying to ensure that he's no longer there.
In this region of northern Mozambique, the jihadi presence hurts business and economic activity. The French oil company Total runs a €20 billion natural gas project here, but it was suspended last April after Al-Shabaab attacked the town of Palma, just 10 kilometers away. Now, the Rwandan army defends the site. Before the uprising, Ismail worked as a cook for Total. Now he lives in a displaced persons camp in Kutunda, near the gas field, and is afraid to go out.
We saw the Al-Shabaab fighters arrive. They killed everyone, cut people into many pieces, and left them spread across the road. When you went by there, you could recognize your family members. We don't understand why they do that. I don't understand why they came and invaded us.
In the area around Palma, some inhabitants have decided the situation is stable enough to go home.
When the Shabaab fighters catch you, they tell you to sit down. Then they kill the men. They tell you to keep your eyes open and make you watch them massacre people, even if it's your own brother or husband. These killers wore military uniforms and had guns. So now when we see someone with a gun, we don't trust them. But we're slowly learning to trust these Rwandan soldiers.
A few meters away are signs of another atrocity. Part of a shoe, traces of a mass grave where a dozen-odd people were allegedly beheaded. Rwandan soldiers now control the area. 3 months since the start of operations, the Rwandan President Paul Kagame came to Cabo Delgado for a military parade organized by the President of Mozambique.
Together, our joint forces have succeeded in pushing back the insurgents. Significant progress. This shows that the Africans are capable and that by working well together, we can find solutions to even our most difficult problems.
The Rwandan troops have no pullout date. The country is taking advantage of their presence to get its economy back on its feet. During the visit, President Paul Kagame and the Mozambican leader Filipe Nyusi signed a trade and investment cooperation agreement.
So I want us to go into today what our reference points are going to be. Today, we're going to be looking at two different things. We're going to be looking at the first one, we're going to be talking about a chapter from The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon called Concerning Violence. And then the second one, we're going to be, of course, looking at an article that was written about Rwanda in Mozambique right now. As we've heard in the video, they have no pull-out date, no date for them to retreat and leave that area, regardless if they say they have resolved the situation and pushed the insurgents back. So priorities for the Rwandese battalion in Mozambique at the moment, as you can see on that map, two places are highlighted. There is, of course, the city of Palma that we've been talking a lot about. That's the one with the natural gas project right there where there is a star, right by the coast. And then you also have the city of Mosimboa de Praia, the one just a little bit of the south. So those are the areas that are easily accessing the offshore project that you see in blue in the ocean for the natural gas project that is being spearheaded by, of course, Total Energies, which was set up in 1924 and is owned and owes its attributes to, of course, the French government. And by this, of course, we're talking about the French colony. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the first issue that we're going to be talking about, we're going to try and look at this idea of collective colonialism or collective imperialism, be it whatever way you want to refer to it as. So in this script, the author says, and this is of course from works of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and it says, the modifications introduced by imperialism and its strategy were expressed through the disappearance of the numerous old-fashioned colonies owing exclusive alliance to a single metropolitan country. So we see this in globalization. So with globalization, colonies started it was no longer that the British owned Uganda, Kenya, and then Tanzania is a German colony. That all started to disappear. So through the replacement of national imperialism by a collective imperialism in which the US occupies the leading position, this meant that now you can have states like Germany, the UK, France, all come together and sit together in one umbrella as collaborating partners and form a collaboration whereby, we'll talk about it further in this today, whereby they can, if it interests the French government, the US will support. But also, why is this important in a situation whereby it's not the French soldiers that are fighting the insurgents in Mozambique? Because we could talk about, Mozambique was a Portuguese colony, by the way. And we can talk about why isn't the former colonizer in that region the one out there fighting the insurgents and trying so hard to protect their business. Now you have the Rwandese government and Rwandese fighters to be the representational colonial force on the ground, plus the Mozambican government. Because let's not get confused that the Mozambican government does not know or have an idea that the Total Energies project offshore does not benefit the people of Mozambique. They know that very well, and they're going to take their pay cut from the French. Let's not be shocked that the Rwandese government, led by Kagame, or the Rwandese militants do not also have an idea that that project will not benefit the people of Palma. If it's been there for that long, look at how the place the place still looks like a ghost town, even before and after the insurgents. Apart from the disappearance of people, the place still looks the same in video footage, like nothing has been changed, not even roads. And this is where the project there, they were talking about it as to be one of Africa's biggest natural gas projects in terms of monetary investment and return. So it makes you start to question this idea of collective colonialism. How has it changed? Because right after independence, or in the post-independence era, you had Germany sit down with, that's why they have NATO, whereby Germany, the UK, the US, Britain, France, I've forgotten the other ones, mainly Western European countries and the US and Canada sit down and start to make decisions about the world. But then it's become very important for them not only to have African leaders, but to also have African leaders who have African battalions to fight their wars. And this is where Rwanda also comes into play, as not only in Rwanda in itself, when we look at the economics and everything around it, Rwanda is not an imperialist country, but Rwanda is pushing the imperialist goals and the imperialist benefits by the acts of their battalion. And this is not to crucify Rwanda only. This also has been the case for Uganda. And then when you start to look at the leaders of Uganda and Rwanda, you start to make a connection as why this is the case. And then you start to think about what is actually happening in the Great Lakes region and who will that region belong to if we're not careful and we do not take a tide with history and let it play out its own self. Because now you have fighters in Mozambique that are Rwandan securing that, and that doesn't sound very different from when, and they're protecting the interests of the French to loot natural resources from the Mozambican people. But then we had the same idea talking about the what was it? They called him the Lion of Somalia. But start to think about what resources was the US stealing from Somalia to have our Ugandan troops be the representation of imperialism in Somalia. So the author goes on to say, the internationalization or syndicalization enabled US imperialism to forestall temporarily an incipient crisis by fulfilling two sine qua non conditions. These are the two conditions that were fulfilled, which was, number one was the need to expand. African countries were getting independence so quickly and fighting off their former colonizer. So the US had to find a strategy of expanding, and with that, they have used globalization as a way to expand. But also there was a need to militarize, and this became very important with the need to militarize the economy. The economy became more about how much ammunition a nation can make. And your power as an economy is not only the gold or the money, but it's also the military that you have behind you, or how much military feel you have in the world. And the US represents it that way. But let's not think that it's the US by itself. It's backed up by all these other countries that I mentioned, from Canada to France to the UK to Germany. All these Western European countries, and of course Canada, they all are in the same bandwidth, and they are using African governments or African leaders who they can use to go into those regions. We'll continue as we'll continue with the show, and I think it will become more vivid why collective colonialism has now expanded into two categories. You have, of course, the collective imperialists who band together and decide what happens to the world. But in Africa, because Africa is now a colony, regardless of how you see your country or nationalism or your nation, Africa is governed as one country. It's seen as one country, and what happens is done to affect that whole place. And in that case, in Africa itself, they have managed to create a group of imperialists who I will refer to as sub-imperialists. They are not really the imperialist powers, but they are sub-imperialists. And this is something that the colonizers did. And right now we see Rwanda walking in that walk. And it's not surprising because Kagame served in Museveni's government. Of course, Uganda has been forced down that lane by the same Museveni as well. If we can continue to the next slide, please. So here I want us to do a little bit of compare and contrast with the first video that we saw, and let us open up our view of the world to, number one, this is not only happening to people in Mozambique, or it's not only going to happen to people in Bunyoro, because further down during actually February this year, Total Energy signed a deal with Uganda already. It's been finalized to start, of course, building the pipeline. So this is for all indigenous people of the world to actually have a right to fight for their land, because these imperialists, or even the sub-imperialists, all they care for is exploiting the resources out of that land. But also we must look at other places whereby people are fighting and resisting this exploitation. And we must understand that it is the government or the state itself, the structures that we have, and say that we have a government or a parliament. It is them themselves who have made sure that the exploitation continues. We have to start to understand that. Not only to understand that, yeah, people go in government to get rich in Uganda, but to actually understand that without that structured parliament, without that manufactured parliament, or I call it, it's almost like theater. Politics is almost like theater now in Uganda. Without those theatrical performances, this level of degradation and ripping people away from their lands will not be happening. What makes that very easy is because people are not allowed to actually go into self-governance, to go and have any autonomy. It is all taken away from them in the illusion of, let's go, we're gonna go through elections, and that takes away the attention from the issues at hand. So I wanted to show this video just so that we know that the fight for indigenous people is not only on the African continent, but it's happening everywhere in time as we live. It's happening in time. And when I say in time, I mean that it is not only the Baganda the Baganda fighting for their indigenous land. It's not only the Cholis fighting for their indigenous land. It's not only the Karamajong fighting for their indigenous land. That is happening all over Africa. And to add on it, it is actually a global problem now for the colonizer, because they colonized everywhere. We live in an empire whereby even here in Canada itself, a settler colony that doesn't belong to the British and the French who are here and impose themselves here, have indigenous people of these lands. And we're going to look at a video from the people of Wet'suwet'en fighting for their land and saying that the government cannot build a pipeline to exploit more resources out of the earth because there'll be nothing left. And they're doing this for the futurity of not only earth itself, but for future generations to have something to look at, to have something to sustain themselves and to live by, and not to live in this model of exploitation that not only the colonial powers, but also for us back home, we have the enemy within. African people like us who care nothing about our people or our progress as a people, but care all about fattening their wallets and building empires. So we'll watch this video and then we'll continue with the program.
I'm Molly, and I'm a Gidimt'en clan member of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, member of the Cassia House. We are maintaining control of Gidimt'en territory out here because Wet'suwet'en laws are being broken and industry and governments are trespassing on Gidimt'en territory. Coastal GasLink, TransCanada has been doing work on Wet'suwet'en territory without free, prior, informed consent, without permission of our hereditary chiefs and our governance system. And we've been pushed to the point where we have to physically uphold those laws by controlling access. It's good to see some more Wet'suwet'en. People might be calling us blockaders, crazy, radicals, and we're just people living out on the territory. We're people upholding our responsibilities and living our natural laws. We're having a lot of fun out here. It's a serious issue and we're taking it very seriously, but we also are spending time on the territory, hunting moose, preparing fresh moose meat, feeding the people. We're doing our activities that sustain us and make us happy and healthy, and that's what makes us strong. We've got families that are coming out. We have hereditary chiefs that are coming out. We've got Skyze, the children of chiefs, that are coming out. These people are learning what it takes to take care of the territory properly. They're learning that at a very young age. Our clan specifically has been talking about these issues for years, creating awareness about fracked gas, the state of the territories, looking at research on certain territories and how they've been cumulatively impacted by different industries, and have come to the decision that pipelines are not something that we can sustain in our territories. We know that Unistoten has been taking a strong stance and controlling access to their territories, which they have full rights and jurisdiction to do under Wet'suwet'en law. And over the years, all of the other Denise and Sakaise from the different clans have gotten up in the feast hall and supported their decision. When something happens in the feast hall, it's public. Everybody witnesses it, and that's our law. It becomes law.
Makes me cry when I see where you used to lie.
It's about our sovereignty. It's about our rights and our title to these territories. But it's also about all of humanity and the state of the earth right now, and the fact that if we don't turn this ship around, it's going to be too late. And we know that because we have a strong connection to the land. Having a healthy territory is part of how we're raising our children. That's how we learned everything about being Wet'suwet'en, is out on the territories. Even just walking the trails, your elders and the people around you would tell you stories about certain places, about relationships between animals and people. They'd tell you certain histories about our chiefs and where they lived and how they trapped and how they hunted. Those are all alive here, and that's what we could lose. We could lose the ability to teach our children according to who we are as Wet'suwet'en people. And it's important to me that the territory is in good health in order to be able to keep teaching my children so that they can grow up strong, knowing what it means to be Wet'suwet'en and knowing the territory and the history of this territory.
So we selected that video so that, first of all, what we have to come to terms with is that we live in a global colony. We live in a globalized world that is treated like a colony, but also as resistors to this colonial reality. We have to understand that we're not the only one resisting, and that the resistance is showing itself, it's revealing itself the same way, and there is so many pressures that are being put on this colony, and this colony is going to fall soon. Because the things that were said in that video, that's all the way from the Wet'suwet'en people. Here I live in, of course, a settler colony. I live on Musqueam people's land. It's unceded and belongs to them. But the British colonizer came here and they turned this place into Canada, which now we call Canada, but it's not really Canada. They turned the US into the Americas, but that belongs to indigenous people and they're still there. So no way should you let Museveni convince you that chiefs wearing all those decorative things is a joke. Because now we start to see our people thrive and proud and be happy to wear all of those. But we're so rushed to go to parliament in a suit. We don't even want to hear what local chiefs or have anything to do with the clan. But that is how we exist and who we are. So what we have to understand is that the colonial state, which is Uganda, with its police, will always be fighting. And the way how it's structured today in unitary, it will always fight the indigenous people. It will make sure the indigenous people do not have right or say. Can you imagine the Wet'suwet'en people have rights to those lands? First of all, they have rights to a lot of land that has already been stolen by the Canadian government, which is the colonizer. But then on top of that, the land where they were taken and shoved away and hid, and they call them reserves here in the Americas. There's a lot of reserves where indigenous people then get those reserves to be their land and it's their law. They can govern themselves on those lands and live their lives there. But because the Canadian government with the Trans-Canadian Oil Company wants to invest and build a pipeline, you now have the BC Court, Supreme Court. This is supposed to be things that help the people in the country, overruling and saying that the Wet'suwet'en people need to be moved off of their land. It's the same example whereby in Buganda, we have a Katikiro, don't we? And we have, they're supposed to be representing us on a national level, but because we're in this unitary mess, Museveni can take to parliament any land that they wish to attain for themselves, and it will be stripped of us. And it will be stripped of Buganda with immediate effect. It only serves what the state wants. We should start to understand that how we're being governed, or the governance that we're in, it is the state's needs. And by the state's needs, knowing that those puppets in power do not govern themselves, you'd have to know it's the needs of the colony, and the colony is headed by the colonizer. Those are the ones that are going to be respected. Not human life, these things we shout about, human rights, not those rights, not the well-being of the people. And all this colony cares about is accumulation and exploitation of wealth. And by that, I don't mean only money. We're talking about resources. It's about resources. And they want to own and have power and autonomy over resources. Because if you think about it, if French doesn't have all this natural gas, why is it in a rush to loot all this natural gas from these places? But I'll go back to the case study we were looking at. Wet'suwet'en won the new RCMP is, of course, the substitute for the police here. Raid on the territory. They raided the territory and wanted to forcefully move the people off the land. It is worth remembering that a lot of leading climate scientists, as well as international energy agencies, both said last year that we cannot afford to exploit new resources of oil and gas if we want a livable future. But this is also a fight over First Nations rights and sovereignty. The Wet'suwet'en have been resisting the pipeline since 2018, establishing a checkpoint on their land that year. Well before this, they have won a landmark land rights victory in the Supreme Court of Canada, recognizing their title in 1997, and successfully fought to stop the Northern Gateway pipeline. But can you imagine, it's the same Supreme Court, but the one of BC, that now has overruled and wants to take the land away from the people. but the Canadian and British Columbian governments are responding with force rather than upholding their commitments to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There have been 4 militarized raids by the RCMP on the site in the last 4 years, resulting in dozens of arrests and international solidarity protests. So I wanted to bring this to our conversation today, to understand or to look at whereby now I live in a settler colony where the British and the French have taken over Canada and created Canada, but where the indigenous people here have no rest. And then we have to think about also where we're from in Uganda, where you have puppets or sub-imperialists such as Museveni, who rely, of course, to an affiliation of an ethnic grouping, which is the Tutsis, and what they are doing to Uganda. So if we could go to the next slide, please. But not only Uganda, all over Africa, that is important. So now we're going to look at a video that illustrates on the rise of civil unrest in Mozambique, what actually pushes people to go against their government at the most extreme measures. How do people start to join or get interest in joining organizations like Al-Shabaab? And what does that mean? We'll have a look at that video and then we'll be back.
This $20 billion natural gas project in northern Mozambique is the single biggest private investment in Africa. The government here hopes to reap as much as $100 billion in revenue over the next 25 years. That's more than 6 times the country's annual GDP. But what's meant to be a gas bonanza for one of the world's poorest countries is developing alongside a deadly insurgency. I'm Mark Davies for Bloomberg Quick Take. Here's what you need to know.
A gente corria lado para outro, a gente às vezes chorava, mas o que deve acontecer, meu bebê pequenino.
Aquele lado de Bonate morreram, mesmo lá na praia, lá onde eu tive, também morreram pessoas, e esse Al-Shabaab.
Since 2017, more than 2,600 people have died and 700,000 displaced as violent attacks spread in the Cabo Delgado province. In March, dozens of people were killed in a raid by Islamist militants just a few miles from the project site. French gas giant Total, in response, halted operations on its $20 billion venture for a second time in 2021.
They have done horrific things. They are still doing so.
They had seen bodies laying on the streets.
Thousands are making their way by foot, boat, and road. Some are being rescued by the UN's humanitarian air services.
Evidence suggests insurgents in Mozambique's north began as an Islamist sect in 2007. By the mid-2010s, it had shifted to armed jihadism. Since the insurgency began in 2017, attacks have ramped up significantly. In 2018, insurgents aligned themselves to Islamic State, and the following year, Mozambique experienced the sharpest rise in Islamist militant attacks worldwide.
The group carrying out attacks in the Cabo Delgado is known as Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab just means the youth in Arab. There is no known linkage with the group with the same name operating in Somalia. The first attack happened in 2017, but the group activity in terms of radicalization can be traced 5 years before.
The jury's still out on the root causes, but there's plenty of debate. Some researchers studying its origins point to poverty and economic exclusion as the main cause. Young marginalized people, the argument goes, became more susceptible to radicalization over time. Some observers say it's been made worse by growing investor and government interest in natural resources with no obvious or timely benefit for locals.
We must understand that we're talking about a very poor country. So poverty is everywhere in Mozambique. Young people unemployed are everywhere in Mozambique. What is specific to Cabo Delgado that those unemployed people can be recruited to join the group. The most important element to consider is the mobilization based in religious belief that people can fight to change the state. People can fight against the government of Mozambique.
I think that much of this really has to do with smuggling syndicates that have been operating for decades, for generations in the area. This is a really rural, marginalized area, and they therefore serve as a very fertile ground for recruitment. And the only source, in a sense, of employment of opportunity is through smuggling networks and through radicals that offer them some payment and some money. And it seems like the smugglers are partly attempting to protect their smuggling routes and building on local frustrations about the potential mass gas exploration that is developing, are able to recruit locals.
Mozambique's army has struggled to contain the violence so far. It's brought in Russian and South African private military companies to quell attacks with very little success. More recently, the state has started social programs targeting vulnerable young people. This in hopes of addressing discontent over a lack of jobs and opportunities. But for now, the conflict continues.
The results are very poor. Even with this assistance for private military company, this group managed to attack and occupy 5 district headquarters, so 5 towns. That is huge in less than a year. Mozambique fought a civil war, 16-year civil war, and did not see such a situation of attacking and occupying district towns like what is happening here.
The region and regional governments like South Africa have long been aware of the emerging problem. But the government in Maputo, like most governments, have said, guys, this is a national problem. We will deal with this nationally. So there's a lot that Southern Africa, the Africa Union, and the international community can do. But eventually, it's all dependent upon the will and the capacity of the government in Maputo. This is their territory. And law and order and combating this insurgency primarily lies there.
The country emerged from a devastating 15-year civil war in 1992, and even now it needs massive funding for development, especially in poorer regions. Gas discoveries off the coast, one argument goes, could be the developmental jackpot the government's looking for. But like in many countries, natural resource wealth doesn't necessarily guarantee economic development or jobs for ordinary people.
It is true that very few of these kind of capital-intensive projects benefit locals. What happens is you get an entire enclave economy, in this case largely an offshore economy, of highly paid expatriates producing limited jobs with all the money, all the consultants going offshore. And none of the locals have the skills to benefit from this. This is an old problem, and you have to find a way of making sure that some of the revenues flow back into the area, either through investment by government, getting the taxes and the income from this. Very few countries, Botswana being one of the exceptions, Australia, Canada, and others, have been able to turn a resource bounty into a real broad-based development initiative. We've seen this in Angola, in Nigeria, where elites seize upon the massive revenue streams that are coming in, and then use that not for the development of the general populace, but to their own benefit. And it requires really a capable government with appropriate compliance regimes to make sure that some of these benefits flow back into the region. It requires a Mozambican government that is really committed to the development not only of Maputo, but to all of Mozambique.
This $20 billion...
And as we can see from that video, I think one thing that I want to say about that video, it was projected that by 2050, I forgot where I got this statistical data from, but about 2050, Africa would be the most youthful, would have the world's biggest youthful population. And that's why you have a lot of people very interested in what Africa is going to become, or how they can mold what Africa will become. But as Africa having a lot of unemployed youth has started to show. First we had the Arab Spring, and then after the Arab Spring you had EndSARS. After EndSARS, we're seeing now what's happening in Mozambique. We also know about what happened with Uganda throughout the Toji Kwatako all the way to November. So this is going to be a pattern that will continuously play itself out. We've seen what's been happening in Mali too. It is the nation itself is crying, and the nation, by that I mean the youth. And until we start to actually get involved in this, we will end up in this same situation that we're looking at now, where you have a lot of youth recruitment and insurgents, and where you have the portrayal of those insurgents solely as insurgents and not as a political question underneath of resources are being stolen. People are given no access to do anything in that nation, are being displaced from their land. And of course, what do they turn to? They turn to violence, because the same thing that's being given to them, not only by the government, but by being in this colony, is violence. We can use this example about Uganda. What did the government expect when it went to Rwenzururu and put violence there? You're gonna get violence back, because already it's violence. What did the government expect? So we have violence replaying itself back, and it's going to be, we are the answer to breaking free of it. It's the same thing when we say Museveni will never leave power without the wielding of the gun. But it's because the colony only allows violence. So the colony must face violence to be disassembled as a whole. So I will go into this. This is, of course, I said, a chapter from The Wretched of the Earth by Fanon. It's a topic on violence. I picked up just a couple of quotes. And the author says, the violence which governed the ordering of the colonial world, which tirelessly punctured the destruction of the indigenous social fabric and demolished unchecked the systems of reference of the country's economy, lifestyles, and modes of dress, this same violence will be vindicated and appropriated when taking history into their own hands. The colonized swarm into the forbidden cities. As if to illustrate the totalitarian nature of colonial exploitation, the colonialist turns the colonized into a kind of quite essence of evil. It's the same story again that we're hearing with, how many times did we hear about youth being radical, them being, how many times, let me use an example of Walk to Work and the Kayunga riots. They were the ones who were being radical. And when they attacked Kasese, they were the ones that were attacking the state operatives, and they needed to be protected. How many times did we view that video when someone attacked? So it's, you have created a portal of violence and expect people not to outburst that violence with violence. And this is what the colonists and the colonizer does. And the same thing with Museveni and his creation of Kony. They will then uphold that as the utmost violence. For example, now we have, of course, we're going to talk further about the Rwandese troops in Mozambique. And then by having them there, we're going to ignore that in itself is a continuation of war with the insurgents, of course. It is still a picture of violence. When are they going to leave Mozambique? What is their cut on this? How about the local people? What are the local people going to get out of this whole project that involves militants from Mozambique and militants of the government and the French government? But when people start to also show violence, then they are seen as the greatest evil. But where did this evil actually begin? Does it begin with the youth who now call themselves Al-Shabaab in Mozambique, or does it predate that and the way how they're being governed? All I'm saying is the violence that is put into a system and the pressure of that violence, especially through colonization, will only get violence back. You cannot go and grow a seed of pumpkin and expect to get a tomato at the end. If you plant pumpkin seed, you're going to get pumpkin back. But then what the colonialist does in this colonial scape, they then start to label that violence being trajected back at their violence as the greatest of evil. That's why now they're talking about they're fighting, like you hear the Rwandese talk about they're fighting terror on the African continent. But the greatest terror is that Total Energies that is going to loot the people of Palma, the people of Mozambique, and take all that money and resources and put them towards the French government and give just a little bit of crumbs to Rwanda and a little bit of crumbs to, of course, the elites in Mozambique. The greatest violence is economic violence, where you make sure that someone can die poor and the worst way, with no access to everything that has been given. Because we want to make this clear that the resources that we find ourselves onto as indigenous people, those are given. No price was paid by my ancestors to live on a land that had gold. They didn't pay any price, they were just born into this world. And it wasn't given unto them for just exchange value, for money. But then someone takes that away from you and expects you to die in poverty because they took that away from you. It's not, I'll take this away and make myself rich and share. It's taken away from you to further make you poorer. We have to understand that the exploitation of the resources of African people is solely to make sure that we remain within the thinking that we are, even all over these videos, they keep saying poor countries, poor countries. What are you doing in poor countries to get enriching resources? These nations are not poor. And when I say poor, I don't mean only natural resources. I mean, we're not poor in elements of, we have, first of all, the ability to govern ourselves. We're not poor in thinking of how we can govern ourselves. That's why the author says that colonialism punctured a destruction of the indigenous social fabric, how we govern ourselves, how we want to live, what we want to do with our resources. We're not short in any way of thinking about ways of how to do that, but because of greed, but because of the desire to dominate. Now you have the creation of insurgents who are then seen as the greatest evils, and then you have Africans going to fight them. And then you have Africans going to fight them. Sorry, I chuckled, but I chuckled because of the irony. We're supposed to be all as Africans working together to secure our resources. But here then you have the Rwandese government securing resources for the French. And the Mozambican government as well, who's supposed to be against all of this, is also at the dining table. It seems like like what we refer to as the Berlin Conference table has expanded, but now it just has a few Africans. If we can go to the next slide, please. The author continues to say, they are revolutionaries, obviously, within these political parties. Among the cadres who deliberately turn their backs on the face of national independence, but their speeches, their initiatives, and their angry bursts very soon antagonize the party machine. So let's actually look at the party machine as the post-colonial state itself. These fractions are gradually isolated. So the people who stand up and go against it, they start to become isolated, then removed altogether. At the same time, as if there was a dialectical committance, the colonial police swoops down upon them, hounded in the towns, shunned by the militants, rejected by the party leaders. These undesirables with their inflammatory attitude end up in the countryside. It is then they realize, in a kind of intoxication, that the peasant masses latch on their very word and do not hesitate to ask them the question for which they are not prepared. When do we start? And I put in this quote specifically so that when we're talking about on violence or the violence, I wanted us to look back at what happened or what is happening. I don't want to put this in past tense because it's continuously happening. What is happening with youth NUP supporters, especially the ones whereby they did not agree with how things were going and did not see things going into plan. What happens now? You have the state. When they start to antagonize the party, which is NUP, then you have the state, the police do its job and start looking for them. Then you have most of them run for refuge or run to the countryside. But to the countrysides where they run to or where they go, it's still the same. They're also waiting for the new coming, for the new government, for the dream that we all ought to aspire to. I must say that this work was written during a time where African nations were fighting to liberate themselves. But till this day, when we talk about how violence is placed onto African people and how it's responded to, the same pattern is displaying itself, and this work remains very relevant. The violence has been imported from the European nations to the African continent. And once that violence was imported and brought to the African continent, now you have people who are signing partnerships, or people with ethnic affiliations, or people with financial affiliations, because also the rich in Africa want to remain rich, with financial affiliations, signing on to agreements to continue this violence on the impoverished Africans. But then whereby when you have people rise up and start to disagree, a political party is formed, it becomes a political movement. But when things are not going past status quo in the political party or as the plan aspired to be, then those fractions of people who do not agree begin to be drifted away from this. And then you start to see the state itself, which should have been anti that political party, start to hunt down these personnel. They start to seek refuge in the countryside or abroad or elsewhere. That's why you have a lot of insurgency happening in the countryside areas, or what we refer to as the rural areas. Let's talk about the north. Why was Museveni in Karamoja trying to retrieve all those guns and ammunitions? It's because people have been pushed out of the city to go to those rural areas because they have not agreed of how politics is running at its center in Kampala, not only because of the politics led by Museveni, but also opposition politics. We have to start to realize that that's the model that's happening when we try to liberate ourselves. Again, I will repeat, they are revolutionaries, obviously, within these political parties. The revolutionaries do join these political parties. Among them, the cadres who deliberately, they start to turn their backs on the face of national independence. People actually started to turn their backs not only this time round, but all the way from the first person to run as an opposition member against Museveni, and that is Besigye. For example, I think about one of the people, I always forget his name. He's imprisoned in Congo and did a lot of mobilization for FDC. But where is he now? In exile in Congo. Not even in exile in Congo, a prisoner in the Congo, in exile too. But their speeches, their initiatives, and their angry outbursts very soon antagonize the party machine. As long as your speech starts to antagonize the fabric of the political party, then you get displaced. So it's almost as though there is no space for a revolutionary in a political party. We have to bring this to the table and talk about it. We could go to the next slide. Now to the topic at hand, we're going to look at, of course, Macron's visit to Rwanda, because this is what actually supplemented Rwanda going and deploying itself in Mozambique.
Picture, please. Picture.
And within the same thread of violence, one thing that we need to understand as people living in the colony is that imperialists and sub-imperialists will put any differences that they have aside if an opportunity of exploiting resources shows itself. For example, with a lot of finger pointing that went on between the French government and the Rwandese government for who really is to blame. And also in history, they teach us that the French and the Belgians played, and of which they played a huge, colonization played a huge role in exasperating the Rwandese genocide. But it wasn't only that. The Tutsis played a huge role as well. And they played a huge role not only for the genocide in Rwanda, but also for the genocide of the Hutus in Congo. But for a lot of finger pointing that went on between the French government and now led Kagame government, Kagame said, President Macron actually did not apologize for the genocide, but Kagame said, even though he did not officially apologize, his words were very strong. So this goes to show you that for their benefit, we need to understand this, Manaya, Africans. Like, we need to understand this. This needs to sink in very well. For the benefit of the colony, the imperialists and sub-imperialists will put their arguments aside as long as they benefit. I'll give you an example. For example, in Uganda, the idea was tubalabise and let's show them all the human rights violence. And that is, yes, we should show and portray that, but do not expect the colonizer or these imperialist powers to have to actually, we're going to see a point in this presentation to then help us. Like, the idea here, what I'm trying to say is, I think the best way that it's been said, we cannot rely on white sympathy tears. They will not get us out of the hole we're in. And then we cannot rely on that. It never works out. For example, a whole genocide happens. We learn about the Rwandese genocide almost every year. We keep reminding, we keep talking. It's talked about on one of the world's biggest tragedies. And it's not even talked about to its full capacity, whereby you have the killing of Hutus in Congo. But even an official apology did not come from the French. But Rwanda is ready to boot up and strap up to go and fight to protect French interests in the natural gas project that is happening offshore. That is the violence of the colony. They will kill as many people as they need to kill, as long as they have sole access of natural resources. And because we have stupid people on the stupid people on the African continent, or elites who have decided to only enrich themselves, all they care about is the little check that they make on the side. But not only that emboldens them, what even emboldens them further is the arms that they get to buy from these Western countries to push back on when people nationally rise. For example, Museveni didn't afford all that ammunition. He gets to pay for it out of all the aid that is given for him for all these humanitarian endeavors, and he uses the same. You have never been killed by a Ugandan. No Ugandan has been killed by a Ugandan gun. Let that sink in. Most Africans have been killed by foreign guns. Till this day, the first gun that killed an African was foreign too. And also right now, all the guns and bullets killing Ugandans do not even get made on the African continent. But they're given as rewards to embolden these puppets to keep on carrying out, of course, the project for the colonies. If we could go to the next slide, please. So on the 27th of May, Macron visited Rwanda. Rwanda's deployment are an extension of French power in Africa. Let's not confuse Kagame as the next Nelson Mandela. I've heard people talk about how Kagame has built Rwanda and Rwanda is an example for all African countries. Let us cut that nonsense out and start to actually look at the reality of what Rwanda is doing, not only in the Great Lakes region, but in Africa, and what Kagame represents. Because if you know the reality of these African leaders who are remaining in power in this era that we're living in, very few or next to now, no African leader is in power that is actually for one, Pan-Africanism, the rebuilding of Africa as one country in a federal government for the benefit of African leaders. This leader, there is no leader in power for that. The last one who tried to do that was President Gaddafi, and he was killed by the help of NATO, and his family was attacked and also killed by the help of NATO, some of his family members, all because President Gaddafi said Africa needs to build its own bank and start its currency. That's why Gaddafi was killed. That's why NATO helped. Hillary Clinton was a part of that deal, and Obama too, because she hoped she would run for presidency and that would look good on her resume. Can you imagine now destroying African countries can be part of a presidential campaign's resume to say, look what I did here. I made sure this doesn't happen. We have to start to understand that our unionization or our collaboration for African people is a threat to the fabric of this colony. So you have nations and leaders like Paul Kagame and nations like Rwanda who are fitting and doing this project. Now Rwanda is actually an extension of French power. How does that make sense in 2021? If we talk about 50 years ago, Africans fought to liberate themselves from France. 50 years ago, Algeria was fighting against the French. And let's not even go 50 years ago. Just last year until this year, you have former French colonies fighting off the French currency. They pay France to use money. And they're saying, no, we cannot do this any further. But here you have Rwanda deployed as an extension of French power in Africa. Not in one place, in Africa. Not in one country, because most people think about, when you think about Africa, you start to think about just your nation. And that nationalism, our nationalism should expand to the region because we're attacked as one. On the regional scene, Rwanda is an actor that matters, and which is at the heart of the capacity that French may have to help bring our regional responses. This is what we're able to do directly this is what we were able to do. And this is Rwanda talking about Rwanda. This is what we were able to do in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is what we should be, this is what should now be done in the Central African Republic or in Mozambique, as we've discussed together. If we could go to the next slide, please. So then the questions start to trickle in of who is actually funding this war. So we'll look at a video covering that, and then we'll come back will soon be wrapping up today's project. I know it's been video intense, but for some people they say, in Luganda I see Amaso Gomuganda. Anyway, I'm not going to try to translate it, but most people believe by seeing.
Rwandan forces have driven out Islamist militants from Mozambique's gas-rich Cabo Delgado province. Their success underlines the weaknesses of the Mozambique's army, but some observers want Rwanda to say when they will leave. Rwandan military announced it had taken the strategically important northern Mozambican port of Musimboa da Praia from Al-Shabaab militants. The jihadis had occupied Musimboa da Praia in the Cabo Delgado province for over a year, but fled towards Tanzania on motorcycles. For Rwanda, a small landlocked East African state, and its president, Paul Kagame, retaking Musimboa da Praia is an important military victory on foreign soil. Rwanda's contingent of 1,000 soldiers is the biggest foreign force in resource-rich Cabo Delgado, which is the site of a $20 billion liquefied natural gas project operated by French energy giant Total. But the area has also seen numerous attacks carried out by Islamist jihadis. The violence has displaced more than 800,000 people. So, why is the Rwandan government getting involved?
And what's the motivation for Rwanda?
The motivation is actually driven by our history. We have experienced this before, and we feel that we should partake in any activity or any initiative that would lead to the security of people wherever we are called upon. We have done it in Kal, South Sudan, Darfur, and we're doing it here.
The Rwandan government frames this as a responsibility to protect mission. This, it argues, has been inspired by international community's failure to protect civilians in Rwanda during the 1994 civil war. The Rwandan intervention in Mozambique came shortly after French President Emmanuel Macron's visit to Kigali in May this year, where he pledged $500 million in development aid. Some commentators have suggested that Rwanda, funded by France, has intervened to protect French interests, specifically the gas project operated by French energy giant Total. The Rwandan government has chafed against the claim that it is simply doing France's neo-colonial bidding. It has stressed the humanitarian basis of its intervention.
So just a little bit notes on that is every time humanitarian reasons are used, but in the face of doing things for humanitarian reasons in this colony or in the reality that colonization has produced, you can only bring that through force. So I want to go over this Rwanda in Mozambique. So, and this is the article that I did say we would be referring to. So according to Total Energies, Mozambique's LNG project provides logistical support to the Mozambican state forces assisted to the task for projecting the project's activities. So this is to answer the question of who actually is funding the Rwandese militants in Mozambique. So Total Energy said, we actually do not give Rwanda money, but what we fund is we do provide logistical support to the Mozambican state forces the ones for the government, assigned the task of protecting the project's activities. So then the French government, meanwhile, has neither confirmed or denied its financial involvement. France is following the situation unfolding in the Cabo Delgado province in Mozambique with great concern. This is what the French government was saying. France stands alongside Mozambique in the fight against terrorism. And I want us to start thinking about the word terrorism and where that comes from and what popularized it. It's again a product of this colony, of this global colony. Terrorism and the fight on terror is popularized by the US. Now you start to see it in other places where this fight on terror is happening continuously. Anyway, I'll continue again with the statements made. France encourages the countries in the region and partners of this country to show support to Mozambique. It welcomes the initiatives taken by the members of the South African Development Community and Rwanda in liaison with the Mozambique authorities to tackle this crisis in Cabo Delgado. And then to the next slide, please. So while we're still there, it was interesting to look up, Total Energies. So from those quotations, you can already tell that there is heavy ties to Rwanda going to Mozambique and France. Rwanda deployed after Macron visited to. In an apology, he actually did not give for France playing a part in the genocide. But then we know, of course, France is backing this up and they're doing bidding. The company that they're actually protecting, or the area that they're protecting, belongs to Total Energies. And Total Energies is a French asset. It's a French multinational company that started in 1924. It was put up, and its job is to find all these natural gases. It belongs to the French. It pays its allegiance to the French. So there's no way you're coming into a region to protect an offshore project that belongs to Total Energies and say you're doing that for humanitarian reasons, and that's your sole motivation. We're not as stupid as we seem, and we've never been that stupid. So when they make these excuses, it's annoying. So Total Energies, along with partners Connaught Limited and the state-owned Ugandan National Oil Company, announced the agreement that will bring output from the Tilenga and Kingfisher fields near Lake Albert and transport them through the planned East African crude oil pipeline. I bring this, and this was agreed on, this was February, it was this year. I think it was February 1st, 2022, when this agreement was reached. And this is if you want to look it up, just go search Bloomberg News and this title, Total Energy reaches financial decisions on 10 billion Ugandan oil. So why do I bring this up? We must start to understand that we're intertwined. What's happening, it's no coincidence that Museveni and Kagame have done their madness the most in that region that we call the Greater Lakes region, stretching all the way from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central Republic of Congo, Uganda, they try in Tanzania, all the way now to Mozambique. It is a creation of a military dominance by them in that region, whereby even the resources are secured and backed up. So here you start to see a collaboration amongst of course, the colonizer and Africans. And it's no coincidence that Total Energies is securing this very easily with Museveni's government, but now has Kagame's government going to fight in Mozambique to secure their offshore project. Let's start to think of this, and I'll accept the fact that our realities are intertwined. If we could go to the next slide, please. So in terms of what does Rwanda actually benefit from infiltrating or going to fight the insurgents in Mozambique, Rwanda is one of the world's poorest country, is one of the poorest countries in Africa, and it's currently struggling to pay for a series of wasteful, prestigious projects. Remember those projects that I told you where Rwanda was being celebrated for building a very big stadium, where Rwanda was, and this reminds me of a quote by, I think it was Julius Nyerere, in one of his paper. He says that development is not buildings. Development can only show itself in the people. Rwanda, in these past few years, has financed a lot of money into all these big luxurious things for us to think that Rwanda is the superpower of Africa, or is the dream that Africa should be, with good looking stadiums, with but that's the illusion of Western colonization. It's the idea that all these big buildings are progress, or all these big infrastructures are development. But how about the people? What have the people gotten? Are the people still struggling to economically access resources? Then you have not reached development yet. Do people have access to healthcare? Do people have access to education? Can people actually go and develop their talents and unlock their talents, and not have to live in a backward, retrograde system that is capitalism? That then we're starting to talk about human development in a way where our culture and our being as people can become radicalized and move away from this transgressive, very backward, very rudiment way of living, whereby the rich become richer, the poorer become poorer, but the rich can only become rich off the backs of the poor. And we're using the same resources that were given to all of us for free. So Rwanda spent so much time building these stadiums, and it's all just staging a show, because they don't have money. I don't know of any big natural resources that they're getting this money from, apart from building refineries to refine African gold coming from other countries. And this is an amazing initiative and a collaboration that can come into place, but not if the Rwandese government is helping French loot Mozambican people. So it continues to be heavily aid dependent. So even if Rwanda is nominally funding this operation itself, Western aid spent in areas such as health, education effectively frees up the funding needed for this kind of operation. And this is something that the West has become better at doing. We come here and we reveal, oh, the West is funding Museveni to kill Ugandans, and people will be like, where is it? Show us the money. So what the West started to do, it's when they give a country aid, and we're going to see in the next slide, we have to understand that it frees up the budget of that country to then start doing all these other things. And they do this to their allies. They have actually African nations who they have allied with to cause chaos in regions. For example, I'll give you Kagame and Museveni's government in the Great Lakes region. And it's stretching its way all the way to West Africa soon. So it is important. And another example is Egypt. Look at what they turned Egypt into. Look at what. So the funding actually that France got, that France would give Rwanda, doesn't come in. It's like, let's stop being childish about these things and look at the realities. If I'm going to commit a crime, because these are crimes these people are committing, I'm not going to write on this check that I'm giving you this check to go buy ammunition. I'm going to do it a different way. So this is what France did. Along with an almost apology, Macron actually offered to give 60 million euro loan to Rwanda to help with COVID. And then they would give 1.5 million euros. And that's a grant. For grants, you don't have to pay that back, to support sports in Rwandan schools. And then the French Public Investment Bank, BPI France, also signed 3 cooperation agreements with Rwanda's sovereign wealth fund called Agasiro. And this will allow for joint actions in terms of direct and indirect investments. I remember last week we were looking at if Russia was imperialist, and I did come here and I talked about the importation of capital, a nation's ability to actually export its capital. And now you start to see the French public, this is the French Public Investment Bank, accepting to open up a relationship with the Rwandese bank and a cooperative relationship, which allows for joint actions in terms of direct and indirect investments. So Rwanda then has the capability to be fully funded by their bosses and become warlords on the African continent. Ever since the colonizer physically moved outside of the African continent, they have found a way through several African leaders and groups and peoples to still control us and loot our resources. And this is how they do it. It's a very simple, very organized way that they do it. If we could go to the next slide, please. And we're going to watch a video on Kagame reassuring that the war in Mozambique will be won to the people.
To Mozambique now, and the latest in the fight against a brutal insurgency. At least 3,000 people have been killed there, and about 750,000 have been displaced in the 3-year insurgency. Now, it all began when militants who call themselves Ansar al-Sunna attacked the port city of Mozambique in late 2017. Then this July, 1,000 Rwandan soldiers began operations in Mozambique. Well, Sky's Africa correspondent John Sparks is with the Rwandan military and reports now from the province of Cabo Delgado.
The war on terror is moving to Africa. And these soldiers from Rwanda are trying to raise morale. We'll never back down from the fight, they sing. And that's exactly what they want to hear in Mozambique, where they have struggled to cope with a vicious Islamic insurgency. Salvation has appeared in the form of Paul Kagame, Rwanda's long-time authoritarian leader. He's deployed 1,000 troops in what may be a long and costly fight.
One life lost is too many.
No time to stop for lunch, replied the Mozambican president, who seemed relieved to have the Rwandans there. Mozambique's poorly trained army was routed by the insurgents, retreating or fleeing from key communities in the region of Cabo Delgado. But the involvement of the Rwandans, who arrived in July, has turned this conflict around. In these pictures, obtained exclusively by Sky News, Rwandan forces confront insurgents in the forest around the village of Nakatenge. Dozens of militants were killed in this battle, claims Rwanda, while others escaped into the bush. The assault, a key step in liberating the port city of Moisimba de Praia. The trauma caused by this 3-year insurgency is hard to accept or understand. At a shelter, we met a mother who said she'd been enslaved by militants for over a year. She escaped with her son during the fighting in Nakatenge. Fadi told me she'd been held with 275 other women by the insurgents.
I think that you are very brave.
Sinhara Chabani also made her escape, but she almost died along with her son as they tried to get away from the insurgents.
kamba kufa na kupona tikiawa tikite tikenenda siku 4 tikiamu nundu satipata ne maji ne kiu, yani waminuka mpaka kupoteza fahamu ya kutoa kidiri kuenenda mwanyotwa mwana si kidiri kumbeba tikenenda mpaka kuja wenzangu mikojo kunipa kunywa.
The leaders of this new coalition know Mozambique cannot fight the war on terror alone, and President Kagame seemed to acknowledge this reality.
President Kagame, what's your exit plan? Because you can't stay here forever. You've said that it is a costly operation.
They need to stay, and for how long? That comes out naturally as progress is made. We change forms of things we are doing, so that we are very free and flexible.
That's a deep and open-ended commitment to fight in Mozambique. And if the Rwandans don't, who will? The Americans and the British haven't offered. But the threat posed by Islamic insurgents is fast expanding in Africa, and the consequences can wear a country down. John Sparks, Sky News in Cabo Delgado.
As I said before, just a few notes from that video. They no longer come. What we need to understand is what the Vietnamese War showed, and also in 1970 when the Americans tried to fight an on-land battle. And even if we go back to World War II, when we talk about on the land battlefield, it was the Russians that won that war for the Allies. Without the Soviet Union at the time, without Russia at the time, Europe would not have won that battle against Hitler. And the US won it in the air. But also what the Vietnamese War showed and what the Somali War in 1970 showed is that they cannot fight on the ground. So that's why in Africa they strategized. They use Africans. And they use Africans who they have put in power, like Kagame and Museveni. That's why when they put Idi Amin in power after Obote, and Idi Amin actually started caring about developing the country, they said Idi Amin had to go. So we have to start understanding that now it's no surprise that now Africans are fighting terror amongst each other, when we all know the biggest terror is the colony that we're in. But before months ago, Kagame was talking a lot about fighting the colonizers and representing this image of being the next Pan-African. It's the same thing that Museveni does, presents himself as a Pan-African and saying he's fighting for all Africans. And they use this then later to go and justify them spreading terror across borders because they're protecting Africans because the West won't. The West doesn't do it because they know if they come and fight Africans or any African group for whatever cause they choose to fight, because whatever cause people are fighting always ends up to be a cause against, of course, Western infiltration on the continent. For example, we're talking about that big, like, we must not forget that this group of insurgents is actually started building up around an area like Palma, where they have that big offshore project. People are seeing money come in and out. We talk about the Congo. They talk about Congo having a lot of insurgents, but that's because of the gold, the diamonds that are being taken out of the Congo. People being rushed off of their lands. And then you start to see Africans being used. Museveni is in the Congo. Kagame is in the Congo. Ugandans are being sent to Somalia. And apparently these people now are fighting terror. But how about the biggest terror, which is this colony and empire we're in? When will us Africans start to care about ourselves? So a few notes from that video was Rwanda does not plan of leaving Mozambique. They have no deadline. They don't know when. So they're there to solely now be the bodyguards for this project. But the saddest part is this is all orchestrated by people on the top. All those soldiers that you see there fighting, giving their life to this, probably do not get half of what the people at the top are getting. And all those people displaced have nothing to do with this, but all for the benefit of a multi-billion-dollar company. If we could go to the next slide, please. Again, as we wind up, we have to go back to collective colonialism because it will show itself in times like this. So the US and UK were pushing against more aid to Rwanda and reducing the package that they give Rwanda because of the human rights concerns. However, Rwanda's intervention in Mozambique could help safeguard against this. The US in particular has shown a strong interest in containing the insurgency in Mozambique. It has recently increased its military training package in the country, this meaning to Rwanda, and has just moved the US ambassador to Rwanda to Mozambique. Can you imagine? Rwanda's willingness to lend a hand in crises across the continent give it leverage they can use at other times. When human rights critics start threatening to withdraw aid, Rwanda starts threatening to withdraw from Darfur or the Central Republic of Africa. And an example that I have for us as Ugandans, in Uganda, when Museveni is threatened, Ugandan troops are spread all over the African continent doing dirty work for this empire. It's the same pattern that human rights was never even the main concern for this empire. It's domination. That's their concern, to dominate. But we then had we just did a whole campaign for presidency, year in, year out, on the sole basis of human rights, fighting for human rights. But every time human rights are brought up, this article is telling us every time you bring up human rights and Kagame's acts against the people, especially what happened in the Congo against the Hutus. And when you bring that up, Kagame can say, I can take my militants out of this area so that you guys don't have the wealth. So just understand that these nations as well, they will not care about human rights. That's not a strategy. That's more something that we need to remember to prosecute these people, but it's not a strategy to liberate ourselves because they don't even see you as human. Let's start there. It goes on. Even if not from France, payment is likely to come from somewhere. Rwanda has a track record of benefiting economically from its military interventions. These are costly operations, and it tends to make sure it's not left out of pocket. It's made its money back for its intervention in the Democratic Republic of Congo by ruthlessly exploiting that country's mineral resources. An obvious question now is, what is the quid pro quo in Mozambique going to be? There is bound to be one. This isn't an act of charity. We are also at the stage whereby African countries themselves have started to participate and be a member of like we have sub-imperialists on the African continent. They take their military in, loot the resources, pay themselves, and also the colony then pays them because they have proximity then on the African continent. So it is up to us to start actually cutting off ties with these sub-imperialist leaders or forms of governance. That's the only way we can secure our well-being or a future for ourselves. That is the only answer. And it is within our power because we are the majority. All those Rwandese militants you saw there oil soldiers you saw there singing and having hope, if they were told, or all these people you see serving Museveni, let me use that as a better example because I know more about Uganda. If we talk about all of our people serving in the police, how they sleep and how they live, you think they will really stay defending and supporting Museveni if there is a clear way for a future? We are the majority. We are the change we want. So we should stop investing a lot of time in all these campaigns. Those campaigns we should not be putting campaigns out to the world. We should be keeping that as evidence for us to prosecute these people within our own right, because they owe it to us. We're not going to get any sympathy. We're not going to get any help. These people have started actually partnerships amongst sub-imperialists on the African continent and the imperialists themselves. It's very dangerous for Africa's future, because we're now back at a place whereby now we're talking about Rwanda being the French arm of militant power, French military presence on the African continent, and almost everywhere we have AFRICOM. Uganda is part of that too, and that is the US's military arm on the African continent. And the only way we can liberate ourselves from that is by starting to change our systems of governance, especially by getting rid of this ruling class. This ruling class has led us where we are now, and what's even worse is that this ruling class has a plan of continuation, and we're just starting to understand where they were at in their plan. So those will be my words for today, and my concluding statement is imperialism morphs and creates sub-imperialists, such as Rwanda, and these exist in the colony now, and the colony is Africa. Until we can fully liberate not only ourselves as Ugandans and changing the form of governance into federacy and giving indigenous people back their rights, but until Africa, which is one country in it of itself, is in a federal of its own to protect the interests of African people, there will be no peace. There will be sub-imperialists like Rwanda. There will be sub-imperialists like when they decide to do it as the Tutsis. There will be sub-imperialists like Museveni and what he's created with the elites. Sub-imperialists will continue to appear, and these are only partners of the bigger colony, and we then remain engulfed in that. So that's all I had for today. And that's all I had for today. That's our program. And if there are any takeaways that you might have taken from today's show, please do take and spread the word, because at the end of the day, this is debt that will have to be paid. And when I say debt, I just don't mean the money. I mean the land, the environment, the people. What will actually be left for our offsprings? What will be left for our people? What will we have left for ourselves? So the only way to do it, we can cut the sub-imperialists from the main channel, which is the imperialists. Because honestly, as I said before, even here in the settler colonies themselves, you look at the States and you look at Canada, they are not like people here, they still have the resistance even within these structures. So the colony is not, it puts up an illusion that they've done everything. They're safe and secured and are dominating power, but that's an illusion. They are not dominating. The people have more say in what happens to them. But the problem with that is that the problem is that there's people amongst the people who have taken opportunity to confuse the people, derail the people, and benefit individually. That's the problem we're facing, where many people want to benefit individually, then actually look at the rising of the people. Until we start to believe in the rising of the masses as African people, we shall not see the change that we seek. You cannot tell me that one person becoming president will resolve all of Uganda's problem and that one person is going to speak to the masses of Uganda. No, we should bring the whole Ugandan peoples into parliament. Give them federacy. Give them recognize the indigenous ethnicities in the area. Give land back to the indigenous people of Uganda. And let those indigenous people start to speak of what they need in their territories. Respect the traditions and the norms that ought to be followed by these people on a national level. Collaborate with each other through unity. It doesn't take anything away from anyone if Buganda is a state on its own, Acholi is a state on its own. It even makes the nation better if they collaborate. If every state fills in the gaps of the other state. But what we've been convinced all our lives is that 600 people sitting in parliament are going to discuss what the masses need. How are you going to start to discuss what the masses need if you're going to drive by Owino in your convoy and splash dirty water at a person selling by the side of the street? How are you bringing that person's concerns into parliament? And that person has to go and vote for you to put you in parliament. So that's the confusion they've put in us. Because then that confusion, now you have African leaders convincing you that they are Pan-Africanists for Africa being one, but are still working for the French, are still working for the US, are still working for the UK. And they are the ones at the forefront of African unity. And when you go back to history and look at the people who actually brought in and brought these things to light, their images have been broken down, watered down, and their histories, Kwame Nkrumah, a whole coup happened to get him out of power. What happened to Marcus Garvey? Why is he one of the most hated people? And he was one of the people out there talking about the unification of Africa a very long time ago, before even Kwame. So we have to start to reckon with ourselves and understand that the power is in our hands. And also understand that what is happening to us, no one is surprised it's happening to African people. It is planned and then it's orchestrated. I want to thank you all for being with me here this evening. And if there isn't any questions or any concerns, I'll say a good evening, a good night, a good morning, or good afternoon to wherever you've been watching the show from.